Hello, and welcome to our listeners to an episode of Career Chat. Today, I'm going to have a chat with Tas Rohila, and we are going to talk about mobile development. This is going to be a very casual conversation. We are going to go down memory lane and talk about how mobile development came about and the modern mobile development. What does it entail? It's something that you can listen to while you're doing something else, but I will launch straight into welcoming our guest and hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Tas. Quick intro about Tas and I. I'm Horatius Albert. I am a delivery manager and a senior leader in the IT industry here in Australia. And I worked with Tas as a lead for mobile development. And from our conversations, we thought it might be fun to run this particular chat. And I'll hand over to you, Tas, to introduce yourself and a little bit of background about yourself.
Yep. Hey Horatius, yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, like Horatius said, we've worked together in the past, especially in the mobile domain space. So if I were to talk about my career, it spans close to 2 decades now. You might not
Awesome.
get that feeling having a look at me. But yeah, it spans around 20 years now, which is sort of divided into two halves, around 12 years in India, specifically Mumbai, and the recent 8 odd years in Australia. So yeah, I started off as uh, a junior engineer in the IT space, dabbled around with a lot of technologies, started with Microsoft Stack. Back in the days, it used to be Visual Basic,
Uh-huh.
using Visual Studio. So developed a lot of innovative apps, especially in the publication space for large publication houses. And then my interest started to, develop further. Uh, Very early days of mobile development was around Palm top devices
Yes.
with Palm OS, and then slowly made my way into the mainstream iOS mainstream development involving Apple devices and Android devices. In the last 8 years, has been fully into mobile application development. So yeah, that's
So
me in a nutshell.
that is awesome. That is awesome. Some common themes there as well between you and I. I have a career close to 20 years as well. Started again in India as well, in Microsoft Stack with some VB6. And, I remember when .NET 2.0 came out and the conversion was all the rage. Like, you're going from 1.1 to 2.0. So yeah, very very interesting. So it brings back a lot of memories there. And thanks for your background as well. Like, essentially talking about PDAs, I remember early days in which we had the introduction of smartphones, but when it came to corporate, it was mostly your Blackberries. So those days, except for BlackBerry, nothing else was being developed as a corporate mobile sort of targeted platform. So if you wanted your emails, if you wanted to do something, like, it was always your BlackBerry, and your selected senior managers had these BlackBerries with they can check email. And from that, the consumer devices were not really thought of as secure enough or powerful enough to do anything, or even affordable enough, right, for everybody to have one. So from that, we came into this mainstream that we have now of all consumer devices being used for office and work applications. It is a very very interesting journey. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, with the nail on its head. Devices like BlackBerry used to be very corporate specific, managers and senior managers, especially because of the push email feature, which was like killer at that point in time.
Yeah.
And Java used to be the preferred technology to develop on BlackBerry, I remember. So in that sense, we have come a long way from smartphones being privileged to few versus Android now, open sourced, and you can get that pretty cheap on any Android devices as well. And when iOS, or rather Apple, stepped into it, it changed the game totally from QWERTY-based keyboard to touch-based, form factor. And I thought when Apple devices came out, they were the game changers because with Apple comes the whole ecosystem of not just the software, but the hardware and the App Store, where you can download only authorized apps that are authorized and reviewed by Apple ecosystem. So in that sense, that whole ecosystem of safety, security, user privacy that was built in versus Android systems, which were more fluid. Anybody could download an Android system and start developing. There was not much in terms of review of any apps that were submitted to the Google Play Store. Google itself has come a long way since then. Privacy is at the core of all operating systems, be it Android these days or Apple. There's not much market share for Windows. We will not talk about that,
Yeah,
but yeah,
died off.
similar to BlackBerry that died off because they were so fixated with their own thinking of targeting only a specific segment, and that's for push notification of email. Then that use case no longer stood relevant, with Android and iOS systems. So we've seen how big giants can get phased out because if they do not keep up with the technology, they get phased out. A classic case
Absolutely.
is BlackBerry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a very interesting transition because we no one thought that BlackBerry would go out like that. But what you said is right. They failed to innovate. So when they didn't innovate, others took their place. But in the world of mobile development, like, can you introduce us to what does mobile development entail, what it includes, and in a layman's term, and can you add a little bit more detail on top of that?
Yeah, sure. So mobile apps have become so ubiquitous with the way we work. If you have to book, say, a holiday, you go to booking.com or Airbnb. At the click of a button, there's tons of information available. Uh, So in that sense, applications that you use on the mobile are mobile applications for sure. So how do they differ from other apps which you use on your, say, desktop? Most of the times when you use a web browser, that's an application that is usually developed in some form of web language like Java, JavaScript, HTML, and the combination thereof. But mobile ecosystem is slightly different to that. Most of the apps that we use are developed using proprietary technologies. So, for example, on iOS devices, your Apple devices, iPhones, and iPads, you use software that is provided for by Apple, and the development environment itself is provided for by Apple. And you typically would use an iOS development language like Swift UI on iOS, and on Android you'd use a development environment which is Android Studio and some flavor of Android. And
Yeah.
these languages are native, meaning they are fully supported by the operating system. And that's why they are called native languages. So someone who is looking to dabble into native technologies and Swift UI on iOS and uh, Kotlin or Jetpack Compose on Android is what they would typically use.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the native side of things because, like, most of the apps that we see, we can see that they are a combination of what we feel to be the real app experience, and then there are sometimes a web portion of it. So, for example, if I use some of the basic apps that we have, like say Commonwealth or banking apps and others, for certain functionality, it kind of looks like it goes to a web page, not really an app, and which we just called web view in the mobile world. Why would you choose web view over a native experience?
Yeah, good question. Typically, organizations, would layer their applications by usages. So, for example, if you are booking an app, booking through booking.com, you would typically see a list of places that you want to book, and then when you tap into it, you go into details of that. So these screens are what are called as the primary bread and butter screens, which generate revenue for these organizations. And these needs to utilize the best of the features that are available from the operating system itself. So in that sense, to be able to leverage, say, a camera feature to be able to say leverage a voice feature. And these are native in that sense. So developers would develop using native languages for that. Because they want to have that crispness of when you swipe, look at the photos, pinch and zoom into a picture. These are the kind of interfaces that users get used to and want to have a very seamless experience with. So these are what I would call as tier one or tier two screens, which work really well when you use native technologies versus, say, an account screen, for example, where you want to see static information about yourself, like your name, your username, your password, or to be able to change your, say, profile picture. These are very low usage screens. People do not necessarily use these screens day in and day out. And so it works out really well if these kind of, say, tier three, tier four screens are developed using a web technology. So typically when there is an app, they also have a website. And because of the form factor, these web views, which you see on a full-fledged browser like Safari or Chrome, can adapt to smaller screens. So there's very minimal work that developers need to do to make that adapt to the form factor of a mobile application. So yeah, to answer your questions, really high traffic screens are typically developed using native technologies, whereas not so very much used screens like account screen, which basically give you very static information, are developed using web views because there's not much value in having them as native screens.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, so if you have, and mobile development is not cheap. So, for example, if you are developing for Android and iOS platform, which are the main two platforms now, you need to have multiple teams or multiple developers looking at each of the platform, and you have to develop the same screen in two different platforms or for two different platforms actually. But if you have a web version of it, like, you're actually targeting three platforms. You have your web, you have your Android, and then you have your iOS, which can be preloaded. And it makes a lot of sense that you put your investment to those experiences, what you want to be at tier one, and then the rest would be slowly, like, you bring those in slowly, which also brings us to another interesting topic because I'm not sure. Sorry, I know that you have worked in areas where you're trying to target both ecosystems. I'm not sure whether you had any standard have used any standard code sharing platforms before, like Xamarin and others. Because when we started mobile development at one of the places I worked before, initially there was this software called PhoneGap, and this was used for writing a software, an app in a particular sort of format, so that then it get compiled into your Android and your iOS automatically, which meant that you don't have to have multiple developers writing the same code targeting one environment and then writing it same again for another environment. So all the rage was about how do we actually get some sort of a language that can address both sort of platforms, right? So PhoneGap was a huge one. A lot of people went behind it, and then a lot of apps were developed in it because of the efficiency factor. I think we kind of realized that it was not that efficient after all, and then scaled back. And when we thought it just died, then came Xamarin, and we had a massive Xamarin team back when I was working at Redify. We and when Microsoft bought Xamarin, like, we thought, oh my god, like, this is going to explode now. There's going to be so much features and everything, but it died off. And then I think the only thing that survived is React Native a little bit. Are there any others, or what are your experiences with these items? Like, it was a fun time trying to like chase some frameworks and trying to be lazy, not to write code for both, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. So back in the early days, Phone Gap or the mother of all such cross-platform was Cordova.
Yes.
Yeah, I had actually dabbled with Cordova a lot when I first started. As product managers, like you rightly said, why do we want an iOS engineer? Why do we want an Android engineer? Can we have a language that we write once, typically used to be Java or JavaScript, and then you port that to each of these platforms? So again, these cross platforms were back then called as application development frameworks, frameworks. So I said, yeah, let's try. I had a big stock exchange as a client back in India, and they said that they wanted their app up out in the market pretty soon, and they wanted to go lean. So we started with Cordova, developed the application, and just before we were to push it to app stores, they wanted a feature to be able to use camera, um, basically to capture maybe a screen or record a video or something like that. But these frameworks did not provide for native access.
Yeah.
We were like, my goodness, what do we do? We started looking on the internet. Is there a free library available? And then on the forums, they said that you would have to write, because essentially these third party, these frameworks, basically what they do is they actually develop a web application, which then gets converted into a native. So web meaning browser, and browsers do not, back in the days, did not have all the bells and whistles that came for native application development. Basically, access to, say, a gyroscope. If you have to see the direction of where you're going, or form factor when you turn a device, it should rotate to landscape, portrait, and stuff like that. And for that matter, even camera or your microphone. So these connectors or drivers were not written, and that still is an issue in many of these frameworks. So we actually had to stall that app then and there because that feature was not provided for, and we burnt our hands. So these frameworks, as good as they sound, if you want to go to the market soon, but you do not want to invest heavily in very native features, like I said, camera, gyroscope, or directions and stuff like that, then organizations can very well go with these third-party frameworks. But if you have to require pure native experiences with use of camera and all these features that come with native application development, then native is the way to go.
Yeah.
And to be honest, when large organizations like Facebook came out with their own version of these, and similarly Microsoft bought Xamarin, they basically had tons of resources where they could focus the energies of those resources to develop these frameworks. But in the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen there have been a lot of layoffs. So who is going to maintain these applications? And obviously then they open source it, but open source community can only do so much to take it forward. But with native, platforms and organizations like Apple and Google will continue to support it as long as they have their devices in the hands of the consumers. And it's not going away anywhere. You might have versions after versions which will basically enhance the user experience, but no way are organizations going to, not provide for an API for camera access or not provide an API for sound access. So in that sense, these features will be fully supported in native languages. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the places where I've seen something like React Native used quite well. I also think that it is slightly easier now with things like React Native to access your camera and basic stuff. Not giving the exact experience you would get, but at least it is reasonably easy now. However, the where I've seen it work quite well is where one of my clients they did a test app to see whether there is going to be an uptake if we do release an app, and they wanted to pilot this and collect feedback in terms of the viability of the app. And they had a very limited budget and they had 12 weeks. So the only way was to do something in React Native. And we had a small team at the time. It was just 4 people from memory. They quickly developed this POC app. It actually looked very cool. And it had to use things like your location information so that you can, because there was a map feature you to find things around you. And the caveat that we mentioned to the customer was that, look, this is a POC app, this is not for production, this is not to scale out, right? If you want it well written, scaled out, then you have to consider which parts you're going to go native and which parts you're going to go go for web views or something like React Native. So yeah, that's it. Reminded when you mentioned about the POC side of things, it reminded me of this particular project, which was quite interesting. It was a good success because we could put that app out there pretty quick. And talking about putting that app out there, what do you see is the current challenge in sort of mobile development world? Like, what do you typically face as a lead that people need your help to navigate with, or even the challenges that face you?
Yeah, so these days, when you put out an app or what we call as submit an app to App Store, like Google is pretty quick. They usually do have their automated scans of the app and approve it close to 1 hour maximum. And gone are the days where Apple used to take a week to approve your app because there has to be someone sitting somewhere in some part of the world, typically in the US, who would pick up a app submission, give it a manual test, basically even sign in if that requires a sign in, and you have to provide for signing details and then basically approve it. And it used to be a very tedious and time consuming process, especially from the Apple's end. And we used to chew our nails whether they're going to approve it, reject it. What happens if it gets rejected? What could be the reason? What obscure reason would Apple give to reject your app? But these days, Apple has done phenomenally well. It takes close to just 12 hours to get the app approved, and much of it is automated. So in that sense, it's come a long way. But when you talk about a prototyping tool where we used to typically use these third-party frameworks, the gap between the way we develop iOS and the way we develop Android applications is closing by the day with the advent of declarative way of doing things. By declarative, I mean you actually have a WYSIWYG like interface where you lay out your text box, you lay out your, say, a map view, you lay out your photo view, and typically, that used to be a very time-consuming process in both Android and iOS. On Android, it used to be an XML-based layout. On iOS, it used to be Objective-C or Swift, and then you have to lay out the constraints. But with declarative way of things, all of this complexity is gone. So when product managers used to say that developing this in Android, in iOS is going to take months of time, such is not the case any longer. And with declarative UI, meaning making use of Swift UI on iOS and Jetpack Compose on Android, things have become really quick. So the time and effort that you would require to develop a web app is now equal with even both the resources for iOS and for Android. So it's become very quick. And the go-to-market strategies for product managers is not, they don't think of it as two separate apps so typically in my team also, what I've done is I've upskilled my developers to learn both sides of the platform. And the programming paradigms are very similar in both iOS and Android these days with use of Swift UI and Jetpack Compose. So upskilling developers to be both iOS and Android because of the minimal differences within the platforms has led to product managers thinking that they can have different resources for iOS and different resources for Android and different resources for web. So in that sense, all of that large turnaround time when you start developing to versus seeing it in the hands of the consumers is reduced dramatically.
Yeah, that is very interesting because cross skilling is so important. And previously, it was difficult because the syntax and language would be completely different, and people would have to learn that new way of working. But with the gap closing, it's much easier. And it's also quite relevant for Australia, right? Like, because we are seeing that the market is a little bit tight. We are being asked to do more with less, and that's one of the struggles when the economy is a little bit flat. Having people who are skilled in both, who can pivot and change, that actually helps the team. The other problem usually is that what I've seen is that sometimes one app, like the iOS app, marches on and Android gets stuck when it comes to when it comes to the app development, or say for example the other way around, the Android marches ahead but iOS gets stuck. So having the developers think that both are part of the same app into platforms or to channels actually, and then you're trying to ensure that the work goes out at a similar sort of pace for both platforms. So that makes a lot of sense, because otherwise they'll be waiting, drumming their fingers while one team charges ahead.
Exactly, yeah, and uh, that brings one very simple thing to my mind was around platform compatibility and similar features on both the platforms. So, uh, what we typically do is that when a feature comes out, both iOS and Android engineers, along with the web, closely collaborate so that platform features look and feel similar on across devices. So in that sense, nobody's working in silos, and you don't typically realize that there's platform differences at a later point in time. Much of it is realized while you're on the drawing board. So in that sense, shifting everything to the left, not just the QA practices, but even the design practices to the left to bring it very early on in the journey so that platform differences are caught early on and there's sort of a semblance of same look and feel across many, many different platforms.
Yeah, that must be a hard one, because I know that iOS interface is quite different to Android. I'm a heavy Android user, and when I get an iPhone, I sometimes freeze, because the create button in Android, it's in a different spot compared to iOS. So you're familiar with certain layouts and certain way of navigation that can trip you up when you go to the other one. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting when we talk about the interfaces, because the functionality might be the same, but the way you approach it for design purposes would be completely different.
Yeah, exactly. Because designers would design it in a way that they understand it best. Most of the designers come from a web background, and so they have to be educated that even though the development part of it is somewhat similar, but each platform brings its own flavor. Like you rightly said, in on Android systems, you typically have a back button, hardware button, or you just swipe and then it goes back to the previous screen. Whereas that is not existing on on iOS. So in that sense, subtle nuances like navigation, the way you interact with a button, or where you would typically find that control. Like you said, an accept button would be a one big button in Android versus it could be a tiny little button in Android. So engineers need to be familiar with what form factor and what platform they are developing and educate the designers that even though it's been designed for one platform, but bring that thought process to the form factor as well, not just on the platform side of things, but if you're designing for a larger form factor like iPad or for tablets, where the form factor is bigger, and then how do you make use of the real estate? Those are the kind of things that engineers need to educate their designers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also remember the designers that used to work for me, they will wait for the design guidelines to come out from Apple and Android. Apple mostly, because they make a big noise out of it as well. And these were very important, because if you are complying mostly to the Apple design guidelines, it's easier to get your app approved as well. And it also helps you actually to give that very native Apple experience, because they actually tell you that this is how you do a new create button, or this is how you tap into some of the resources that Apple already provides you for design. And if you are a designer listening to this podcast, it is something that you should check out, whether it is Android or Apple. There are design guidelines that gets refreshed as part of every iOS release, and I believe even in between, and they actually follow that, and it helps them quite a bit. Cool. Talking about designs, talking about design, and there was also something that you mentioned about beginners coming into this particular format, right, or development. I know you have mentored a lot of people. Share a little bit of your experience around mentoring people, bringing them into the mobile development world, and how do you go about it generally, and what do you see, what do you want to see in somebody who's stepping into that sort of mobile world?
Yeah, so my mentoring journey goes back as far as 15 years ago, where very early in my career, when I sort of graduated into a more senior roles back in India, there is always an expectation that as a senior engineer, you start training a junior engineer, start mentoring a junior engineer, and organizations would typically have a good mix of seniors and junior engineers. So in that sense, I've had a really rich experience mentoring people. So what I've noticed is engineers, graduate engineers, fresh out of universities and colleges, bring a whole lot of new perspective to the way you think, because in our day jobs, when we are working towards a specific project target, be it that's part of some of the OKRs, you tend to focus more on delivering those features, and sometimes don't get to step back and think if something could be done in a different way. Fresh engineers are very good at that. So I've always valued their contribution in that sense, in that aspect, where they challenge the status quo or even recommend something that can be done, because they are more adept with what's happening, what
Oh
the
yeah.
current trend is. Like they call them the TikTok generation, and we obviously need to help them in their career journey. And as I grew into my own career space, what I've also started to realize is that every individual is different in that, right? Some like to explore newer side of things. Some like to understand what's currently happening within the product base. So understand their needs and their requirements, okay, first of all, so that you can cater that experience for them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
what
What I've seen you do is also, like, you give them actual pieces of work to do. Like, so that actually provides them with the motivation that it's not just a training exercise. So that is quite helpful as well.
Yeah, very true, Horatius. If we ask them that they can contribute to the actual app that's out there in the hands of millions of users, they obviously get very thrilled to see that what they're doing is having an impact on the product itself in the hands of the consumers. So yeah, let them work on. I usually let them work on a small piece of feature that ties into a bigger feature. Be it an interaction with a button, or be it doing some sort of UI enhancement, fixing a bug, which gives them insights into how the code is aligned,
Yeah.
what are the bigger building blocks, and how their code gets stitches up into the bigger scheme of things. And with that, also gives them an idea of how testing is performed. So take them through the entire process of how development is done, how testing is done, how integration testing is done. And what we typically do before releasing a feature is we all get together along with the product, all hands on the deck, testing those features and ironing out the bugs. And then finally, the deployment side of things as well, how it is submitted it to a app store, what does the review process look like, and how that approval um, takes shape. Or for
Absolutely.
that matter, the CI/CD, continuous integration, condition development side of things, how a application gets deployed into the cloud and stuff like that. So take them through these journeys, give them specific tasks, give them certain challenges as well, that you don't give them or spoon feed them. Make sure that you don't spoon feed them. Make sure that they are challenged enough in to go back on their own, research, and come back with an implementation that may not be fully compliant with how you do your coding practices, but then at least they have gone through their own thought process and come back with something rather than you providing for that solution to them. So in
Yeah.
that sense, take them through that journey step by step and give them enough challenges.
Yeah. And learning nowadays, like, and this is where I think AI is also assisting the young developers these days, because I see that AI is being used in organizations to boost productivity for especially for junior developers and even for seniors, actually. Like, they help with code reviews, they help with learning, like, you can actually ask AI, like, I want to learn about this, and it will provide pathways and things like that. Have you dabbled in it? I know you have dabbled in AI, but like, but I only know a little bit about it. So why don't you take me through a little bit about um, AI in mobile development, and how it is changing things?
Yeah, we can't stay away from AI any longer. Uh, it's there omnipresent in whatever we do these days, in terms of assisting engineers in the way they do things, is boosting productivity to another level. As engineers, we are expected to don different hats at the time of the development. Obviously, develop it using the best practices, then QA it, meaning you need to put on a QA or a tester hat, and then integration test it and deploy and fix bugs. So there's several different hats that we need to don, and there's typically not much time to be specialist in each of these verticals. And these have become actually verticals these days, because you have a specialist QA role. But with lean nature of organizations, QA roles are more focused on mentoring the engineers on how to do exploratory testing or how to cover for different use cases and stuff like that. So in that sense, code completion, or rather AI assisted code tooling, is now ingrained into the way we develop. So you have, GitHub Copilot that sits where you develop things. Like there's a Visual Studio Code plugin, there's plugin for Xcode, there's plugin for Android Studio. And what engineers would need to realize is that these assistants or AI itself is not going to replace them. It is there as a assistant, as a code pair programmer with you in various different steps of your development journey, so to speak. So while engineers are, say, writing use cases or test cases, you can actually carve out a nice prompt that, you want to develop this feature. What are the use cases that you need to cover? So just like me and you, when you are pairing, you would bring certain thought process to it. So similar is AI assisted programming. Ask for a prompt at that what stage of development you are at. And when you are actually code reviewing somebody else's code, while you are thinking through it, if there's something that you think that the code assistant can help you with, for example, finding the efficiency of a particular block of code, you could ask the AI assistant to analyze that code, and from security perspective, from PII, personally identifying data information regarding a user perspective, or from a memory leak perspective. And these situations at any stage of point help boost productivity.
Yep.
And these days, there's also a concept of mob programming, or rather what is called as I'm just forgetting the word, but even non-developers like a product manager mob programming, sorry, can jump onto this platform and write prompts that you want a web page which captures user data in terms of these forms and sends out to a backend API, and would actually spit out an interface that you can see then and there how it's performing. And then through live chat, through that interface, you can tell to shift that UI element here, UI element there. In that sense, it's no longer, even though the code may not be of the highest quality, but at least to see something that you have in your mind as a product manager or a UI UX designer, code assistant is helping you get there.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also called vibe coding somewhere.
Vibe
Yes,
coding, that's what, not mob coding. Correct.
yeah. So I heard about this, and there are some apps out there that allows you to do this as well, right? So if you look at the no code platforms, they're now starting with some of this. Not starting, I would say some of them are actually quite advanced. One is, I think, Bubble. Another one, so Microsoft Power Platform is another one where they're trying to be a no code solution. So you try and code with AI, or try and create apps. Another interesting one that we all know about, Salesforce started as a no code solution to everything, right?
Ah.
And I think Salesforce employs more developers now than anywhere else. I'm just It's not. It's probably not factual, but um, it hasn't taken away the requirement for engineers. But it started out as a no code platform. You don't need developers anymore. You just need Salesforce, which is the dream. Um, so yeah, quite interesting. Quite interesting. We'll watch to see where it goes, because what vibe coding also is saying is that, look, anyway, like, you just test until you get it right. So say what you want, something gets generated, and you just keep testing it until you actually get it right, and until the AI gets it right. You did mention security, and essentially, like, uncovering vulnerabilities and things like that. So can you give an overview generally, like, what we consider for security in mobile development? Because for web apps, we add sort of firewalls in front of it. We make sure that the APIs are not harnessed for, like, taking your data away by
Bots.
providing yeah, by bots, and providing random requests to it. So how do you protect mobile apps, and what are the steps to do that?
Well, these days, Apple and for that matter, even Google are very strict on what is the kind of user information that you are asking when a user installs your app onto the device. So obviously, the app is basically composed of native screens and web views as well. And web views need to be GDPR compliant. If they are having cookies that store user information, then similar to the web or the desktop side of things, you need to ask users about their consent, whether they want to allow those cookies or not, or what are the cookie settings. But security is inbuilt into the platform itself these days. What I mean by saying that is, on Apple side of things, they rolled out framework across the devices called App Tracking Transparency. So when a user installs your app, you need to ask for user consent about whether you want that app to track you or not to track you. So basically, Apple and Android have given that choice in the hands of the users rather than the app developers. So if the user says, ask app not to track, you cannot send any information regarding any personally identifying data, be it about the device or any fingerprinting or any user information onto any third party platform. And if you violate that, then your app would get rejected on Android and iOS platforms, period. So in that
That's
sense,
yeah.
yeah, in that sense, there's also a lot of emphasis on what kind of data you're collecting, not just on this platform, but also if you're integrating with, say, Facebook or TikTok, for that matter. You need to also provide that kind of information onto that platforms every half yearly, I think, where you say if you are collecting certain data, what is being used for? Is it used for tracking or for serving, targeted ads onto the platform? So in that sense, personally identified information cannot leave the device without the user's consent these days, and all of the security mechanisms are built right into the platform.
That's good to hear. And I think from a code perspective, we also have tools that scan the GitHub repository or the code repository to, because a lot of companies are now automating that. A lot of organizations, they um, software that would scan your code base for any existing vulnerabilities and any sort of libraries that you're using that have open vulnerabilities, and then alert you for that. That's another side of the security as well. And it's common for both web native or even general middleware applications, because it's based on code. As long as the cost is not prohibitive, like, you should target it at the most vulnerable sort of applications. That is quite interesting. Probably something to end on a note around where the industry is actually heading. I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, where do you think the mobile development industry is heading, and anything else interesting you have seen in the recent times.
Well, for sure. Well, mobile industry, things keep changing every now and then. Every year, you see major platforms like iOS and Android come up with their own versions of what they are looking ahead. So Apple would have what is called as Worldwide Developer Conference. Google will have their Google Developer Conference where newer features in terms of platform, newer features in terms of what's coming typically get announced. And developers actually look forward to these conferences to see what more can the platform offer, because ideas are obviously evolving. You would want to develop that very cutting edge shiny new feature, but if the platform does not provide for that, then you tend to get limited. So in that sense, for engineers who want to know where the platform is going, I would advise them to have a read and watch videos of WWDC, as we very fondly call it, or Google Developer Conference, to see where the industry is heading at. But from a personal standpoint, I would say on-device AI assistant personalization is something that would become really big going forward. What I mean by that is that, say, if when you use an app, you tend to perform certain repetitive functions like search for it, bookmark it, and then later on follow up with that, be it a shopping based app or be it a online commercial listing where you see listings and then shortlist them. So in that sense, I would want to have those experiences, say, on a home screen right there. So of all the favorite things that I've saved, all the international bookings that I've done, all the trips that I've done, and if I would like to combine all of these to uh, for my upcoming holiday, then I don't have to go through that process all over again. Apps should intelligently be able to understand what my preferences are without sending my personally identifying information to third parties, of course, and be able to cater to that unique experiences for me at the click of a button, so to speak. In terms of hardware, I think wearables would become really powerful.
Yep.
I saw a video of few around maybe around 10 years ago where a research scientist at Google was demonstrating that he wore just one wearable, and through gestures like if he had to click a photo, he did like a camera gesture, and it captured that frame that he put up. Or if he wanted to see time, he just did a dial on his wrist. He saw time on there. So in that sense, it may not become a reality, but what I think is the world will head to is wearables where computing power would be infinite, meaning just as you have free Wi-Fi when you go into a mall, computing would be available somewhere in a very large, sort of a thick server, and you yourself would become a thin client where you do not carry much computing where you go, but all the computing would be available to you at the press of a button or a gesture in that sense. So the thin client and the thick server, that kind of paradigm would come back, is my prediction.
That is a very interesting thought. Thank you so much for that, because that is something we can imagine for the future. It's like I've seen this in a science fiction novel where they talk about electricity being everywhere and you don't need wires anymore. I know wireless charging is only at its infancy now, right? Like in terms of you have a wireless pad and you actually put your phone on there. But imagine if you don't have to keep it at specific spots to charge. That would be interesting. So very similarly, the idea of a thin client and you don't have to actually rely on a heavy computing machine, that would be a very interesting one. You also mentioned, I want to call out that you also mentioned about the consolidation of some of that AI in the personalized space as well. Because when I think about the current AI apps or apps with AI, to be honest, it's almost like you open WhatsApp, there is an AI assistant. You open Zero, the accounting software, there's an AI assistant. You open something else, there's an AI assistant. At some point, some of these have to go to the platform layer instead of having an AI assistant for each. You probably have an AI assistant very similar to your search provider, right? Like, you can choose whether you want Google or Bing, and very similarly, like, you can choose which is your AI assistant, and the apps will actually talk to it. So everything comes together in one place. So
Mhm.
interesting thoughts. Thank you so much for your time, Tas.
Thank you so much. I really thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries at all. No worries at all.